We are now in the age of biology. How will the biotech revolution change our economy and society? What is its potential for transforming warfighting and national security? Is the United States prepared to seize the pole position? I'm your host, Navin Girishankar, and today we speak with the Vice Chair of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, Dr. Michelle Rozo. Dr. Rozo, we are delighted to have you here in our studios for Betting on America podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
You are the Vice Chair of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, and the Commission just released a comprehensive report to Congress, and something that's based on 2 years of research and consultation. Before we get into the key messages of the report, can you tell us what the Commission is, why does it exist, and why is its work both timely and important?
Of course, happy to do so. First of all, thank you again, Navin, for having me here. It's an honor to be here, and it's really exciting to finally be able to share what we've been working on for the last 2 years. But as you say, before we get into the meat of it, let's do a little bit about what we are and who the Commission is. So you can think of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotech as a legislative advisory council. We are a group of subject matter experts, of former government officials, and a bipartisan and bicameral group of elected members of Congress who Congress asked to advise them about the intersection of national security and emerging biotechnology. We were created by a National Defense Authorization Act, and we were asked to look at how emerging biotechnology would impact the future of defense and national security and make legislative recommendations back to Congress. I want to pause a minute on our members of Congress because I think it's so important that we had elected officials serving with us for the last 2 years. As I say, it was a bipartisan, bicameral group. We had 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, 2 senators, 2 members of the House of Representatives. Our chair is Senator Todd Young, who I know was on your podcast just a little bit ago. He spoke about a number of topics, but touched on biotechnology and the commission work. It was a great episode. And the importance of having members on our commission was twofold. First was that they were able to work with us and road test our options and policies in such a way that they would work for bipartisan members of Congress. So what you will see that we've come out with is something that's immediately actionable. The second is that they focused us on legislation. And so we are really oriented towards Congress and what Congress can do for emerging biotechnology and national security. The last thing I'll say of why now is that biotechnology is going to have enormous impact across national security. And this means traditional defense, but also economic security, food security, health security. And we are coming up to this inflection point of the technology. And so Congress had asked us to do this work by design in advance of this coming ChatGPT moment, if you will, for biotech, so that it could be prepared to take the pole position, as you said in your intro.
Oh, that's a great overview and a good segue to my next question, because I'm a lay person, like a lot of lay people who don't understand exactly what biotechnology means. And could you help us? What is biotechnology?
Yes.
What are the components of it? Why is it important? How does it flow through to our economy?
Of course. So biotech is simply directing biology to specific outcomes, to build new products, new processes. It is by no means new. We as humans have been leveraging biology for thousands of years. And you just have to look into your refrigerator to see the outputs of that. Think of things that are made by fermentation, which is a term that I think people are familiar with. Cheese, wine, yogurt, beer, right? And if you think about brewing beer, you give a yeast sugar and it converts that into alcohol, right? And so we've been leveraging biotechnology since the dawn of humanity. With modern biotechnology, it's been around for about 50 years. You can think about actually editing organisms, directing them more specifically towards directed outcomes. And recombinant insulin, for example, was one of the first products on the market that was done with the sort of modern biotechnology in the early 1980s. But what we are coming towards now is this inflection point, this intersection of really advanced engineering biology tools. You may have heard of CRISPR, along with automation to standardize and accelerate the experimentation process, and artificial intelligence, which of course underlies automation, but can now be used to really probe deeper into biology, which is very complex. It's been hard to direct biology to what we want it to do, and start to streamline that in our understanding of the technology. So let me give you an example of this. We know ChatGPT, right? This has now exploded on our consciousness. We've been able to train foundation models like these large language models on the corpus of information on the internet, text, imagery, and now we can probe ChatGPT and ask questions. Many of us use it in our day-to-day lives. The same thing is happening in biology. So we can train foundation models on biological language, the A's and C's and T's and G's that make up the genetic code, or the images of protein structures, which underlie how they function. And in doing so, scientists can now more exquisitely be able to ask a foundation model, design me a biological system that can perform this function, like a drug function, and accelerate this design, build, test, learn cycle, and really transform biology into an engineering discipline. So that is what we are on the cusp of. This is what the inflection point is, and when it arrives, it will impact every aspect of our economy, everything from medicine to food to agriculture to industry and defense.
Profound change. I think your report says biology is evolving from a field of discovery to a field of design.
That's right.
And I think you kind of bringing biology and biotech and AI together, it's kind of an accelerant to this, if I understand it correctly.
That's right. That's right. It's because biology has been, as I said before, increasingly complex. You're working with living systems and parts of that. And so it's hard to direct it to where you want it to go. With artificial intelligence, we can begin to make sense of what is really complex information and help use these computational tools to sift through large amounts of information and help make sense of that for scientists.
So that's mind-blowing in terms of its possibilities and opportunities, new ways of new products, new ways of addressing health and different aspects of human life, agri-tech, so on and so forth, but also lots of risks.
Yeah, so biotechnology, like all technologies, are not inherently good or bad, right? It really depends on how it is used, how it is developed, deployed, and the ultimate output of that technology. We lay out in the report the enormous good that can come from biotechnology if it's used in the right way and with our values to build, to help, to feed, to defend. But then if it is imbued with other values, how it could be used to do the opposite of that in really profound and serious ways to attack, to destroy, to harm. And so it really matters that the United States is at the forefront of this technology to imbue our values and the way that we want this technology to ultimately benefit Americans to come forward and be the ultimate output of biotech. One of the aspects that I think is really exciting about how biotechnology can impact our national security is thinking about our supply chain and the supply chain vulnerabilities we have today. So I like to walk through two examples here, both of how biotechnology can provide drop-in replacements for things that are in our system today, and then talk about new capabilities. So if you allow me a bit more of some explanations. So trade analysts have estimated that the amount of the inputs to our economy that could be made with biology is at 60%. So think about everything that goes into our economy today, most of which are not biological, things like plastics and chemicals and materials. 60% of that could be made instead with biology. So if we go back to our beer example, which I like to use, we can now edit the yeast organism or the biological organism using genetic tools and our artificial intelligence to help us design that, as we just described, and convert that metabolic pathway so it takes in sugar or other raw materials and transforms that instead to a chemical or material that we can use in our system. BCG does a great overview of this in a publication called Synthetic Biology is Disrupting Your Manufacturing. And they give an anecdote around one chemical called 1,4-butanediol, which probably no one has ever heard of. There's no reason to have heard of it. I certainly have. But you probably interact with it on a daily basis because it is an intermediate chemical that goes into polyurethane, which is in like spandex and in the lining in your automobiles. And this in 2020 was a $5 billion industry. the traditional manufacturing facilities for 1,4-butadiene or BDO, there's 5 of them, the main ones. 3 are in China, 2 are in Xinjiang. So there's implications for that. This report goes on to describe how U.S. companies are innovating around making bio-based BDO, so doing that same sort of editing that we described to make an organism convert sugar and raw materials in the United States into a bio-based BDO and building a full-scale facility to do this manufacturing in Iowa. So double-clicking on that for a minute, that looks like taking a supply chain that right now goes through China, right, bringing that to the United States. And it's not just onshoring or reshoring existing legacy manufacturing. It is actually creating entirely new manufacturing. This is such a key thing because we offshore this manufacturing in many ways for reasons, right? And this enables us to bring back, good manufacturing jobs, new manufacturing jobs that are sustainable, that, look like brewing beer, right? If you think about, what that looks like in your communities. Now, instead of just beer, you can brew chemicals and materials and the things that are necessary for the U.S. and its supply chain. So it's a really transformative potential for our economic and national security.
Let me just pause there because really it's important to reflect on this for a second. One is that, coming into this, I would think of the biotech value chain and the dependencies that we have with respect to other countries. What you're describing is biotechnology allowing us to overcome those dependencies.
That's right.
While at the same time generating jobs at home.
That's right.
So it's like a double win. This is very, very interesting. So I just wanted to hang on that for a second. That's important.
I agree. And I think when people think about it, they think about overcoming existing vulnerabilities in like our medical supply chain, of which there are many. We are dependent on China for the raw ingredients in our medicines that make up the medicines in your drug cabinet, for example. But biotech can help with other supply chain dependencies as well. The other example I like to give is rare earth elements, which we're all talking about today in Washington and across the country, right? Because they're critical for semiconductors, our cell phones, cars, our weapon systems. And we have real dependencies on this, again, as your audience will well know. Biotech can solve for this. So there are existing deposits here in the United States where there are rare earth elements that we can't get out because the mining deposits are too complex. So our existing technologies don't allow us to separate those effectively. And then we have rare earth elements in electronics. So I don't have my phone with me, but of course there's rare earth elements there. Once once I'm done with it, you could recycle that and get some of the rare earth elements out of there. But again, that's really complex to do with existing technologies. It's not efficient enough to make it useful for full-scale production. Biotech companies are innovating around this problem set right now and designing biology, proteins, microbes that can efficiently bind to and extract specific rare earth elements from mining deposits, from e-waste, thereby opening up potentially new sources of rare earth elements here in America.
Wow, very eye-opening. And, we, in our department, we spend a lot of time focusing on economic security. And for good reason, it ends up focusing on protecting our assets and our markets. What you're describing also is how innovation is the enduring source of economic security going forward. Innovation in biotechnology, in the different areas you mentioned, and how that bleeds through or flows through the different sectors.
That's right.
Very, very interesting point. Okay, so I want to talk about national security for a moment. Help us understand what this means for defense, what this means for our war fighters, because that's also an important application.
Of course, and this gets really to the heart of our work because we are, at our core, we are looking at biotechnology for defense and national security. And similarly, as I described the potential for supply chain security, biotechnology will be a game changer for the major problems facing our military today. You can think about logistics on Japan, secure supply chains, operational readiness, and military medicine. And I like to give a couple, again, examples here. So we just talked about how we can, using the beer analogy, how we can bring supply chains back home to America. Those could be things like the chemicals that make up the materials in our clothes or our automobiles, help us with rare earth elements, but it could also be the starting materials for the Defense Department. and the Defense Department, like the United States, have sole source or foreign source for major components of the supply chain, right? And so the DoD right now is innovating around and working with industry to develop biomanufactured routes of production of critical chemicals and components that make up the DoD supply chain. So that could be here in America, but it could also be forward deployed to solve for logistics on demand. So I'm going to keep stretching this beer analogy, if you will. But if you can think
Which
about...
I'm sure some people will appreciate.
Yeah, right. If you can think about, you can brew beer in a massive, major facility. You can do it in your community, but you can also do it at home. And as this was something in graduate school. I don't know what it is about scientists and brewing beer, but a lot of my friends in graduate school were home brewers, and so they had their equipment at home and were making all these different kinds of brews, right? The same analogy goes true for the Department of Defense and National Security, where you can brew these chemicals here in America, but you can also forward deploy them and have these manufacturing small forward deployable facilities on a boat or at an operating base.
Wow.
And so you can solve for logistics on demand, making the things that our service members need where they need it.
Yes.
This is not science fiction. This is under development today. And again, this is everything from medicines to foods to materials to chemicals that make up the raw supply chain. And this can greatly solve for some of the issues that our military is struggling with today when you think about having to be so many places and project power in many hemispheres across the world. Another example, so this is, thinking about new capabilities.
So just sorry, you're de facto shortening the supply chain.
That's right, shortening the supply chain.
In real time.
That's right, in real time.
Tremendous. Yeah.
And removing the need, which is dangerous for our service members to have to do resupply and supply missions, right? To move supplies from bases into front lines. Like that is an enormous source of potential conflict and issues for our service members. So it also helps protect them. You don't have to do that in the future anymore. You can actually make the things where you need them in the theater, in the field. Really game-changing potential.
Wow, yeah.
Another example that I like to show here, this is, and I have a prop. So for those listening online,
I'll try
to describe it, but maybe this is for those who want to jump on YouTube to see this. Okay, so the golden hour is the critical time period following trauma, during which treatment significantly improves patient chance of survival. And one of the things that greatly improves chance of survival is access to blood and blood products. But as you can imagine, blood is not always available in combat environments, right? Or in remote areas of the United States. As we know, blood is always in short supply. It needs to be cold and refrigerated and blood typed and all of this stuff, very complicated. And so that's not always available in combat environments. So with this technology that's under deployment at DARPA, and what I'm holding up is two bags, one that has a demo of hemoglobin and another freeze-dried plasma. You could essentially crack these like glow sticks, move the dried material into the liquid, and be able to make a field deployable blood.
Wow.
Thereby potentially turning the golden hour into a golden day.
Amazing.
Amazing. Save lives on the front lines.
Is this already being used right now?
No, this is under development at DARPA, so this is a prop for purposes for today.
But so we have a good insight into what may be coming.
That's right, exactly.
Fantastic. Thank you for bringing that prop.
And thank you to DARPA for letting us show this off. I mean, really exciting capabilities. But what you'll see is that a lot of this needs to move forward from research and innovation into commercialization.
Right.
It needs to be forward deployed. There are some technical limitations, but there's also challenges with just the strategic direction from the United States and prioritization. And so we have recommendations that help to address all of those and really get these technologies.
I want to come to this because it's a huge point. But before we do that, you ring the alarm in this report about the competition from China.
Yeah.
And you do it in a way that, it really was eye-opening for me, which is we're kind of at this point where, if I understand it correctly, and I want you to describe it in your own words, that they are about to lock in their advantage. And there's a window for us to really make sure that we stay ahead in life sciences and biotechnology. Explain that to us, because this was a big part of this report.
Yeah. And it was one of our most critical findings. So what we'll say is we have, and what we've found is that we have a 3-year window for action, absence which we feel as though China will gain the leading edge and this will be impossible to regain. Because we're waiting for this ChatGPT moment, this inflection point, that when it arrives will create economic, geopolitical, national security leverage, the ability to really move biology to all of these applications, that will create this moat so large that it'll be very difficult to overcome. And while we're waiting for this ChatGPT moment that is rapidly advancing, what we are seeing is a DeepSeek moment occurring in China. And what I mean by that is that China is starting to out-innovate us.
Wow.
In biotechnology and do so faster and cheaper, particularly in pharmaceuticals. And I look at some of the data that I have on my sheet here to really detail this point. But 20 years ago, the CCP made biotech a strategic priority, and we're seeing the results show here. So these are drugs that are coming through and being approved by the FDA that come from Chinese biotech. You see large multinational pharmaceutical companies seeking out Chinese biotech for innovative licensing and IP deals. The global share of Chinese pharmaceutical output increased from just 5% in 2002 to 25% in 2019. And the market value over 5 years from 2016 to 2021 grew 100-fold to $300 billion.
Yeah.
So you're really seeing not just fast following, which is what we tend to talk about when it comes to the CCP and technology areas, but out innovating the United States in pharmaceuticals. And what's right now happening in pharma could be soon coming in the other sectors that biotechnology applies to. So when you look at agriculture, China's now outspending the U.S. and the EU when it comes to R&D
on
agriculture.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And in 2019, for the first time, China applied for more international patents, and many of these were with CRISPR and agriculture. So again, thinking of this leading edge genetic editing technique in agriculture. But this can also be coming in industry and defense. If you just go back to publications in synthetic biology, in 2010, researchers in the US published 45% of the world's most highly cited papers, Chinese researchers just 13. Now this is flipped by 2023. Chinese researchers publish 60% of the most cited papers, U.S. just 7.
So the quantity and quality of research is accelerating.
Yes, that is correct. And so what you're really seeing is the strategic direction by the CCP is paying dividends, and Chinese biotech is out innovating us, and again, in many ways can do so cheaper and faster because of their system. And conversely, the U.S. approach has been piecemeal. Up to this date has not been coordinated and done so at a high level. We have not made biotechnology a strategic priority. Our report and our recommendations to Congress aim to change that and lay out a roadmap to ensure that we can remain at the leading edge of this critical technology.
Wow. And so let me just try and understand this. If I think of the sources of competitive advantage for the Chinese, you talked about research, you talk about lab to market, the ability to scale. What are the other ingredients of their competitive advantage in biotech?
Yeah, so the strategic direction, the top-down support that they have for biotechnology means that you can move all of the products or the compelling research from the lab to a variety of applications.
Right.
Here in the United States, we have history of innovation. Our R&D ecosystem is one of the best in the world. And really, modern biotechnology is a U.S. invention. Our market is really second to none, and we have the best place to innovate and do biotech.
Right.
We have a well-established investor group that focuses on biotechnology for therapeutics, but there is less of an attention and a focus to biotechnology for all of the other applications that we've discussed: agriculture, energy, industry, some of the really novel defense applications, of where there's still high risk and where the market, return is uncertain or less defined. China doesn't have those same problems, right? Because of their strategic direction and top-down control, they can direct biotechnology to a variety of different applications and products. And so in that way, they are able to move biotechnology in a variety of different directions.
And yet you say something that it struck a chord with me, which is don't try to out-China China.
That's right.
So tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah. So we've just described how China is using vast amounts of government funding and this sort of brute force economic tactics in order to move biotechnology and propel their industry forward.
Yeah.
We should not attempt to do that. That is not the U.S. system. That is not what we do. And so we're recommending a small, targeted spend in very strategic focused areas on behalf of the U.S. government to unlock the full weight of the private sector and bring that to bear to biotechnology. So I just went through and described, some of the limitations in our existing system with targeted actions by the U.S. government to make for example, the U.S. government a better customer of biotechnology, to streamline regulation for some of the products coming for ag or industry or defense, to support manufacturing and pre-commercial manufacturing facilities. We can change that risk-reward calculus for the private sector, take on some of the risk on behalf of the government, and really unleash the private capital in the U.S. in full support of biotechnology for a variety of applications. So that's the American way to do this, and that's the type of recommendations that we recommend in our work.
Playing to our strengths.
That's exactly right.
Okay, great. So you take inspiration from the semiconductor experience and what we've done with CHIPS and Science Act and other measures in the last few years. And do you see the same type of toolkit at play with biotech? You mentioned strategic capital, but there are other elements of it as well.
Yeah.
Right?
We have learned, I think, through the last few years, a variety of different ways that we can think about promoting and protecting our technology advantage, right? And we can learn from those lessons to apply them to biotech. But biotech looks very different. It is a unique technology. It is very diffuse, diverse. As I mentioned, we're not yet at that leading edge. So it looks different from semiconductors. But we're seeing some of the same trends. So when we think about semiconductors, we had a history of that manufacturing moving offshore, right? And we're seeing the same trends happen in biotechnology already, where we're having U.S. companies where the innovation is here in the United States, but U.S. companies are looking internationally to do their manufacturing.
Right.
Because accessible facilities for early stage scale-up don't exist here in the United States, but they exist in Europe, they exist in Asia, and so our companies are forced to go abroad when they would rather do their manufacturing here in the United States. We aim to change that, and we have recommendations around creating pre-commercial, accessible infrastructure that companies and startups can prototype and pilot their manufacturing processes and be able to show their investors that this is working, and thereby, again, play to our strengths, to our market, and move these capabilities forward. But the trends that we saw in these other industries, we are seeing again in biotechnology. So, everything that is repeating, right? And it's not new. We're seeing this again. We're seeing it again in the Chinese playbook of how they are trying to access U.S. IP and information. It is all the similar tactics and tools coming back around again, and it's just not a one-size-fits-all approach in how we think about applying them to biotechnology.
Yeah. Let me make sure I understand this correctly.
Yeah.
Is that you're providing the basis, for example, through a tech hub for companies to be able to be involved, undertake research, test what could be commercial applications, but the sort of sunk costs early on of doing that are absorbed in a sense by policy.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So two things are at play here. One, we are still kind of accelerating what biotechnology and biomanufacturing ultimately should look like. So if you think about, again, back to our brewing beer analogy, you're going through different phases, different sizes of scale up throughout manufacturing. So you start small and then you repeat it at a larger scale and then a larger scale till you get till commercialization. That's a really expensive, CapEx heavy process to have that much steel on the ground. And so we are innovating right now in new ways of doing this manufacturing and continuous manufacturing, flexible manufacturing, more standardization. Right now that's all bespoke for different products. So we have a series of recommendations around focused research challenges for biomanufacturing that really unlock this next paradigm shift of how we can do this type of manufacturing so we can forward deploy it and get it where it's needed. At the same time, as you describe, companies today need access to infrastructure, and they're having to spend their own capital to do that. By the government supporting this pre-commercial facilities that are accessible and enable companies to come in and pilot their manufacturing processes and work. One of the critical things here of how this has worked in other areas is that they get access to really specialized trained workforce, people that are skilled in biomanufacturing and are able to help them optimize their processes and get this off the ground to be able to show that it's working and delivering product that, again, that's what investors want to see to be able to move to next stage of development and put additional funding into those companies.
All of these are different elements of an ecosystem that you're describing that we need and that we should invest in a way that plays to our strengths. I was going to ask you about the workforce piece. Maybe you could mention your recommendations and your thoughts on that, because it seems a non-trivial amount of effort that we need to make sure we have a world-class workforce for biotech.
Exactly. And this is an area that was of deep focus to us. We are not prepared to meet the broader needs in workforce. And biotechnology talent and the demand for it has grown almost exponentially in the last 5 years. Demand for computational and AI-driven biotech jobs has grown by 140% between 2018 and 2024. And the demand has not the supply has not kept up with demand. And so we're not producing enough students. The number of masters and PhDs is only about half of what's needed in the industry. But we don't need just masters and PhD students. We need the manufacturers, to really power this explosion of growth in what will be the next, wave of, an industrial revolution and how we make products here in the United States. So if you look at how much demand there is coming and the workforce we have, we're really just scratching the surface in what is possible. So we have a series of recommendations for how to look at. And I should say there's another aspect of this, too, which gets back to the U.S. not prioritizing this sufficiently in the past, which is we need a bioliterate government. And this is the term that we're using of bioliteracy to understand, the components of biotechnology and be able to make policy decisions that support that future workforce and support, this entire ecosystem as you described. So we have a series of recommendations of how to increase the bioliteracy of the U.S. government, ensure that we have policymakers, relevant officials at departments and agencies that are at a senior enough level and that have expertise in biology and biotechnology to be able to make these decisions, and then recommendations that deal with how we grow the talent across the United States for manufacturing jobs, for the really high demand that is here and that is coming for what is, an explosion of potential jobs across America.
Yeah.
And I want to emphasize this because it's one of my favorite things, and I think one of the best things about biotechnology is that it's not just segregated to the coasts, right? This is not a technology that exists in only pockets of the country with only people with specialized expertise. Biotechnology and biomanufacturing is really for everyone. Potential is across the country. And so when you think about biomanufacturing and what we're seeing facilities, they are being built in the Midwest next to farmers and cornfields, and is able to pull in the surplus agriculture from those fields and use that at the starting material to biomanufacturing. And so you see jobs all across America. It's not just the corn, in Iowa or Indiana. It can be the raw material in Washington and Florida and Kentucky. That's also, an engineering challenge, what we call flexible feedstocks. And we have recommendations there, too, to really unlock this potential across all of the United States.
This is such a huge point. I just want to spend a second on this because, when you think about, say, the tech hubs agenda under the CHIPS and Science Act, kind of the concept there is that there are these opportunities with advanced technologies that are geographically dispersed. And, we're coming on the tail end of 50 years of what President Trump and President Biden and now President Trump again have said are people and places left behind. And you're showing through this report and through this work that biotechnology opens up opportunities all across the country in different geographies and in different sectors. And this is quite interesting, and this is why I think we got to educate ourselves about what you're saying here.
I couldn't agree more. And again, it speaks to why I'm so passionate, and I think our fellow commissioners are so passionate about this, is because the potential for job creation all across America. This is something that is accessible. I want to emphasize, you don't need a PhD to fill these roles. These are jobs, good manufacturing jobs that will exist across the country from coast to coast in those communities that have been left behind.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm just going to run down here this all the keys on the keyboard. You talked about strategic capital, public R&D?
Yes.
So say something about that for a second.
Yeah, this has been a historic strength in the U.S. is our support for R&D, and it's really created the ecosystem that we enjoy today. So you look at many of the leading biotech companies, they have been recipients of non-dilutive funding from the government, whether that's SBIR grants, America's Seed Fund, if you will, NSF, NIH, DOD, and we show an example of amazing research coming out of DARPA. And this has really spearheaded this emerging biotech ecosystem, not just in the United States, but in the world, because again, modern biotech is a U.S. invention. So it's coming from, expertise in the United States and with allies and partners as well. We need to capitalize on those strengths, and we recommend, as I've detailed, grand research challenges that we asked one of our commissioners, who's a leading scientist, to think of the hardest problems in biology, that if we solved them here in America, it would unleash this potential for the economy, for manufacturing. And we lay out a series of grand research challenges in both how we make biology really that true engineering discipline, and then how we make it manufacturable. Yeah. And how we do that all across the coast. So we have laid out, those elements in our report and recommend that we engage in this sort of grand research challenges across America.
Research, strategic capital, workforce, place-based investments. This is like a lot for us to think about in terms of the toolkit, but it actually reflects what I would say is the modern economic security toolkit for the United States. And biotech is emblematic of that.
That's
from
right.
what you're saying.
That's right.
One more thing that you mentioned, and I just wanted to ask your thoughts on
Sure.
this, is the need to defend. And that's export controls,
That's right.
investment screening,
That's
those
right.
types of protect tools.
Yes.
How do you see those playing out when it comes to biotech?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we have a series of recommendations around the protect tools, and we really have a two-phased approach. It's both run faster and slow China down, particularly where there's the potential for misuse and leveraging biotech for national security applications that would harm the United States, right? And so we recommend export controls and modernization to investment screening to be able to address the vulnerabilities that we're seeing, data security measures to protect American sensitive data, biological sensitive data. But critically, as kind of getting back to the semiconductor example, we can't adopt a one-size-fits-all approach for these tools. And I think the export controls are a good one to spend a little bit more time on because we're familiar with the export controls and how they've been used for semiconductors and what is really some of the probably most exquisite manufacturing equipment in the world, right? And that exist in only a couple places around the world with the leading manufacturers. And so the ability to do targeted controls on these really precise choke points have the potential to create a large window of opportunity to prevent weaponization of semiconductors by adversaries. Biotech, conversely, looks very different, right? It is diffuse, it is diverse, and we're not yet at that leading edge. So all of the key components of how we engineer biology, the equipment around that, we're still accelerating those equipment. We're not yet at the EUV level of equipment, right? And so we're still innovating around how we do all of the fundamental components of biotechnology faster and cheaper and better, right, and more exquisitely. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't use export controls. It just means we have to have a different philosophy for how to use them. We have to be both more aggressive, but also more nimble. And so be able to put them on, but then take them off when they're no longer representing a choke point. And so we lay out the philosophy to do that. And really that will depend on industry working with the government proactively, helping identify what is actually controllable, and then partners and allies, being able to do that in concert so that we can ensure that this technology, remains in the hands of those that want to use it for immense good, as opposed to those that could use it for immense bad.
Yeah, it's a great distinction, just understanding where the field is relative to, say, semiconductors, and that then changes the mix of instruments, or at least how much you weigh on one instrument versus another. Right. It's nuanced, it's important, and it kind of goes back to your point of having a bioliterate government.
That's right.
Meaning,
That's right.
we need to understand this. We need to understand the field better to be able to institute those policies. So that's a great point. We are in an era of universal and reciprocal tariffs, and I wanted to raise this because you mentioned about how biotechnology can help us resolve supply chain constraints. But biotechnology in the various areas you mentioned are also part of global value chains.
Mm-hmm.
And so trading partners are important.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned choke points. How should we think about our ability to out-innovate the Chinese, our ability to stay on the coal face of this technology,
Mm-hmm.
In a world in which there are, let's just say, a higher level of trade barriers and maybe potentially ongoing, I don't want to say trade war, but at least trade conflicts that's the era we're in.
Sure. So we have a series of recommendations around working with partners and allies to remain at the leading edge of biotechnology. It is, as we've just been talking about, it's so diffuse, it's so varied. We can't get there alone. And critically, this is not partnering for partnering's sake. It is because there are really inherent strengths across the international community, across our partners and allies when it comes to biotechnology. As commissioners, we visited 14 countries across 5 continents while we were going across our work to really identify where pockets of excellence were across our partners and allied ecosystem. For example, we talked a lot about biomanufacturing and how those flexible facilities don't exist here in the United States. Well, we visited an example of one of those in Belgium with Bio-Based Europe. And so we were able to take that concept and bring it back to the United States. But it would be great to work together with our allies, on flexible manufacturing and making sure that this is standardized, right, that the regulatory approaches are aligned so that we can pool, the potential of these capabilities together and deliver products that, align with our common values. And so we have a series of recommendations on how to do that, on how to work with our partners and allies to both promote the technology but also protect it.
Yeah. And from what you're saying in terms of just the scale of the top-down Chinese model, we need our allies to be able to prevail.
That's right. We will not be able to do it alone.
Fantastic. Like you and the senator have laid out significant challenges, huge opportunities. So this is a Betting on America podcast. Like, tell us, why should we bet on America on this important area?
Yeah. Look, we know Congress has a lot to focus on this year, right? There's a lot of priorities and a lot of things that we need to do. But I think critically, Congress has asked us for these recommendations. They asked us to look at biotech and national security. And as we've said, biotechnology is a U.S. Modern biotechnology is a U.S. invention, right? It is a U.S. strength. It is something that we is kind of a fabric of our DNA, if you will. So we've laid out a series of focused strategic recommendations that have put into play. We think they're realistic. We think they're achievable now. We can, capture the pole position, which I loved your description on the intro. We can remain at this leading edge, and we can grow jobs all across America.
Dr. Rozo, you've rendered huge service to the country through your work on this commission, and thank you for coming here and sort of sharing all of this with us. Thank you again for joining our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Thank you for joining us for this eye-opening conversation with Dr. Michelle Rozo. You can find this episode of Betting on America and more at csis.org, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. This is Navin Girishankar reminding you that everyone has a role to play in winning the tech race.